It was supposed to be just another high-profile interview to promote his new film, a gritty, soul-stirring drama based on a real-life wrongful conviction case. Denzel Washington had done hundreds like it over the years, and yet, something about this one felt off the moment he walked into the Good Morning America studio. The lights were too bright, the air felt too tense, and George Stephanopoulos, seated at the center desk with his signature smile, gave off a vibe that didn't sit right with Denzel. It was polite, but performative. Like he already knew how the conversation would go regardless of what Denzel had come to say. In the green room just minutes before going live, Denzel had made one thing clear to the producers. We talk about the movie, the story. Not politics, not media narratives. I've done my share of those conversations. Not today. The producer nodded quickly. Absolutely. We're just celebrating your work. But Denzel wasn't naive. He'd seen this game played before. When the camera light turned red and the familiar GMA jingle faded into applause, the segment kicked off with the usual praise. Academy Award winner, director, and one of the most respected actors of our generation, Denzel Washington, is here with us this morning. Good to see you again, George opened warmly. Denzel smiled, relaxed a little. Good to be here, George. For the first few minutes, it was all about the film. The real-life story behind it. The powerful performances, the emotional weight. Of the role, Denzel spoke with his trademark mix of humility and passion. The audience, both in the studio and at home, was hooked. But then came the pivot. George shifted in his chair, a subtle tightening in his face. Denzel, before we let you go, I do want to touch on something. You've recently made headlines for comments you gave at a press event in Chicago, specifically your remarks about the media playing a role in dividing communities along racial lines. Would you care to clarify what you meant by that? The moment froze. Denzel blinked once, then gave a faint smile. You see, I knew this was coming. You said we were talking about the film. We are, George replied quickly. But you've always been vocal about larger issues. And this struck a chord. No, what struck a chord? Denzel cut. In his voice, calm but razor-sharp, was how quickly the media twisted something I said about unity into a controversial take. I said the media sometimes prioritizes conflict over truth. And look how fast that got turned into me being anti-press. George kept his composure, but the air was growing noticeably thick. But isn't it fair to say that lumping all media into that criticism is dangerous? Especially now, when trust in journalism is already fragile. Denzel raised his hand. Let me stop you right there, George. I didn't lump anyone. I spoke about systems, not individuals. But it's always the same thing. Someone like me speaks up, and suddenly, it's spun into outrage. Like I don't have the right to point out how the system works. Come on! A sharp breath was heard off camera. George tried again. But by calling out networks like ours, I never said your network, Denzel shot back. But if the shoe fits. A long silence followed. The director frantically motioned for a commercial break. The screen abruptly faded to the show's logo, and the broadcast cut out what the audience didn't see. Denzel standing up slowly, calmly. You ambushed me, he said to no one in particular, though his eyes were locked on George. George rose. That wasn't an ambush. That was journalism. Denzel stepped toward him, not aggressively, just with gravity. No, that was baiting me. You weren't trying to understand, you wanted a moment. A clip to go viral. Producers stepped in, trying to de-escalate. Security was quietly called. Denzel was asked politely, but firmly to leave the studio. He nodded, grabbed his coat, and before walking out, turned to the camera crew and said, "Truth don't always fit into your segment blocks." The studio stood silent as he exited. By the time Denzel reached his car, the story was already making waves. Headlines blazed. Denzel explodes on GMA Washington versus Stephanopoulos live TV showdown. But for Denzel, it wasn't an explosion. It was a refusal to play along with the game he'd seen played 1,000 times, and it was only the beginning. In the hours that followed the tense exchange, every corner of the internet lit up asterisk clips of the confrontation, trimmed, looped, captioned, and sensationalized flooded timelines. The hashtags #DenzelSpeaksTruth, #GMA Clash, and #MediaVSTruth trended simultaneously on X and Instagram. The video had been online for less than an hour and already had over 2 million views. Asterisk mainstream outlets framed it as a breakdown, an emotional outburst, even an attack on journalism. But to many, especially among younger and more diverse audiences, Denzel was a heroic man who stood unflinchingly in the face of media manipulation and said what others were too careful to say. He stayed quiet through the initial storm. While publicists and PR experts debated strategies. Denzel refused to release a traditional statement. "I don't need to explain myself to people who don't want to hear it anyway," he told his team. Instead, he picked up his phone and called someone who did want to hear it. Ayanna Rhodes, a 28-year-old independent journalist and podcaster, who had earned a loyal following for her unfiltered takes on culture, race, and power in America. Ayanna was stunned when she saw the caller ID. "Mr. Washington," she said, stumbling over her words. "Is this really you?" "It is," Denzel said with a chuckle. "You've got a mic, right? I think it's time we had a real conversation." 2 days later, the Ayanna Report aired its most anticipated episode ever. No sound bites, no edits, just a raw conversation where Denzel unpacked everything: why he made the film, why he called out the media, and what he saw happening in the country today. What they did on that show, he said calmly, wasn't journalism, it was framing. I walked in thinking we'd talk about a story meant to open people's eyes to injustice. And I ended up being put on trial for speaking the truth. That's not conversation, that's control. The episode broke every download record Ayanna had ever set. Within hours, it became the #1 podcast on Spotify and Apple, quoted in think pieces and replayed on news segments around the world. And then came the unexpected turn. The next morning, George Stephanopoulos showed up to GMA looking worn, quieter than usual. Before the cameras rolled, he asked the producer if he could have 2 extra minutes to open the show. It was an unusual request, but they granted it. Live on air. George looked into the camera and took a long breath. I've interviewed presidents, generals, whistleblowers, and I've made a career asking difficult questions. But what happened earlier this week with Denzel Washington didn't sit right with me. Not because he pushed back, because maybe I wasn't really listening. The room behind the cameras went still. He continued, the media often claims to seek the truth, but the truth doesn't always come in clean sound bites. Sometimes it's uncomfortable and sometimes it challenges the very institutions we work for. And if we're not willing to let that truth be heard, then maybe we're not really doing journalism after all. Some called it a calculated PR move. Others called it brave. But one thing was certain. The clash had shaken the entire network out of its usual rhythm. Behind the scenes. GMA quietly reached out to Denzel's team, offering to host a follow-up interview on his terms. Pre-recorded, no ambushes, no edits, just a chance to revisit the film and allow the real message to shine through. Denzel declined. Instead, he issued a short, handwritten note shared on his Instagram. When you say the truth, expect to get kicked out of the room, but never stop saying it, the rooms will change. The post hit 10 million likes in 24 hours. And just like that, a fiery clash that could have easily been buried beneath spin and scandal turned into something bigger. A cultural inflection point. A challenge to both media institutions and public expectations. A reminder that not all heroes are polite, and not all truth fits into a morning segment. Weeks later, Denzel's film opened to critical acclaim and box office success. But more than the film, it was his his refusal to bend under pressure that became the real story. And George V. began quietly supporting independent journalism projects, including Ayanna's. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of defiance to break the script.